Okay, so I guess good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone around the world. So welcome to tonight's Frontier Dialogue, the third wave of fintech and the transformation of financial markets. Now, we are standing today at the edge of a profound structural shift. Looking back, the information revolution has reshaped our world, first through the internet, then through the blockchain, and now through the artificial intelligence. And today we are watching these three powerful forces converging into what we call the third wave of fintech. While it is clear that AI and blockchain will transform the financial system, the pathway forward is anything but certain. It is very interesting to observe that different countries and jurisdictions are exhibiting sharply distinct approaches to integrate these technologies. As a result, we are witnessing a profound regulatory and strategic divergence among the US, Europe, and Asia, to cite a few, regarding the very future of global financial infrastructure. And I guess there are good reasons for this. We can think about at least three core tensions. Firstly, how do you handle the friction between the rapid technological innovation, financial stability, and regulatory compliance? Second, how do you handle the relation between sovereign fiat currency and private digital money? And third, how do we define the roles of the financial institutions, including the central banks, the banks, and other financial institutions in the new financial architecture of tomorrow? And these are important and practical issues. It is our mission today, then, to bridge the wisdom and reach some consensus, hopefully. And so the first speaker, to do that, we have gathered a truly distinguished panel of leading scholars and frontline practitioners. I'm really looking forward to hearing their thoughts and the interactions. Now, let me first introduce the first speaker, Professor Darrell Duffy. Darrell is a distinguished professor from Stanford University, and he is truly one of the best I know who has been at the cutting edge of research on financial innovation and policy implications. So let's hear what Daryl has to say to talk about the relation between this wave of fintech and the potential transformation of the financial system. And I think his title is the tokenization of finance. Daryl, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Chan, or Long, if I may. And
Yes, please.
thank you, Li Dong, for impaneling us. We have a terrific group of speakers today, and I'm just going to try to motivate why I believe the tokenization of finance is a movement that will continue uh, after certain impediments have been overcome. But it's the future of financial markets, as I will explain. So I'm going to use a few slides to do that. I'm going to draw near the end on some new work on smart contracting in financial markets with Professor Wang Chaojuan at the University of Pennsylvania. So first, everyone knows that stablecoins are a phenomenon, particularly in the markets for cryptocurrencies. This is a projection by Citibank of the growth of the amount of stablecoins outstanding by the year 2030. If you look on the horizontal axis, there are three scenarios, A, B, and C, meaning modest, moderate, and optimistic. I'm going to I'm going to provide a hint of skepticism about the growth of stablecoins as a substitute for US deposits in the US domestic economy, and in particular in the both in the retail and in the wholesale financial applications. And I'm going to explain why. Part of that is my skepticism about whether, for retail purposes, Americans are likely to actually switch from their use of credit cards and other legacy payment systems to stablecoins until stablecoins have a killer application, which currently doesn't exist in the domestic retail economy. And partly over my concerns about whether stablecoins are suitable for wholesale financial markets. I am optimistic that there will be growth in the international use of stablecoins, US dollar stablecoins in particular, as a substitute for cash in the international setting. But that's not my topic for today. So let me proceed and try to explain my sense of skepticism about the use of stablecoins per se in finance, but talk about the tremendous promise of tokenization of finance. So here's an example, which is actually quite realistic. A US bank will pay $500 million for 400 million euros with an EU bank. Once the trade is agreed, the US bank will be hesitant to simply send $500 million dollars to Europe, not knowing whether or not it's going to receive the 400 million euros. This famous example is the failure of Herstatt Bank in 1973, when in the middle of the day, the German bank failed. It actually went bankrupt in the middle of the day, and the US bank, in this case, it was Citibank, and on behalf of its customers, lost $600 million dollars in that example. Since then, there has been a development of financial market infrastructure called CLS Bank, or Continuous Link Settlement Bank, that stands as a go-between. You can think of it as a virtual island in the middle of the Atlantic that holds the $500 million dollars coming from New York and waits and doesn't send it to Europe until it receives the 400 million euros coming from Frankfurt. And then once CLS Bank has received both payments, it passes on the dollars to Europe and the euros to New York. This is legacy. This is now legacy market infrastructure. It has costs, and it also doesn't cover a large fraction of global bilateral wholesale foreign exchange payments. Because of that, there's been experimentation with new methods for handling cross-border payments. Project Jura between the Swiss National Bank and the Banque de France, Project Cedar between the New York Fed and the Monetary Authority of Singapore are merely two examples. And later I will discuss Project Agora, which promises to put cross-border transactions, foreign exchange on blockchain or on some form of programmable ledger. Let me explain how this is going to work with a programmable ledger. So here we have the state of the ledger xt at time t, which represents all the positions held by all of the market participants that have access to the ledger, and all of the existing smart contracts that arrange for the exchange of one asset for another on this programmable ledger. This at time t+1, the U.S. bank will send a cryptographically signed message to the ledger, committing some $500 million of its holdings of US dollars on the ledger, committing those funds to the European bank irrevocably, provided the European bank will do likewise within a stipulated amount of time with its euros. And you can see that in this outcome illustrated on the diagram, the EU bank indeed cryptographically commits 400 million euros from its wallet on the same programmable ledger to the US bank. The smart contract will recognize that both parties have met their payment obligations, and then it will release the dollars to the European bank and release the euros to the US bank. By so doing, both banks are free of gross settlement risk, and they don't need a trusted third party and all of the costs associated with that infrastructure. They can also do trade reconciliation by observing what's happening on the ledger. I see Kelly Matheson is here today. She may be speaking about this later today. Canton is the programmable ledger that has all of these capabilities. They can keep this information private or release it to exactly whomever they wish. These transactions can be conformable with other forms of transaction on a programmable ledger. So what's not to like? Well, let me explain in a next few minutes what's not to like about the current state of affairs in this setting. So here's another example. In fact, it is on Canton. When last August, there was an actual live exchange of US Treasuries for a stablecoin known as USDC that's issued by Circle. This was done through the cooperation of the Depository Trust Corporation, which allowed treasuries that were held in a conventional ledger to be tokenized onto the Canton ledger. And with that, the dealer's or seller's position in those treasuries was able to be exchanged with the buyer's cash in the form of USDC using the same kind of uh, atomic settlement that I just explained on a programmable ledger. Again, in this case, it was Canton. So this is a major innovation, and the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation has now received permission from the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US to tokenize US Treasury securities, 1,000 different equities, and potentially in the future, essentially all securities that are held on DTCC, which amounts to about 1 trillion, pardon me, 100 trillion of securities, which means that the tokenization of finance can proceed, perhaps once we solve the problem of what kind of cash should be used. And let me explain this problem. The use of USDC in this setting, well, first, before I do that, let me show you how this is done on a abstract programmable ledger. So the timeline is along the horizontal axis at the bottom. At time T1, you can see the positions of investors A and B in their wallets of bonds and cash. Investor A will sell bonds to investor B. So at time T2, investor A moves some of the bonds from its securities wallet into a smart contract, irrevocably committing those bonds. Then at time T3, investor B moves some of its cash into the smart contract, irrevocably committing that cash. At time T4, the smart contract recognizes, this is just software, that both investors have met the terms of their agreement and releases the cash to investor A and the bonds to investor B. So then they now have control over those assets. They can move them off chain if they want to, where they can continue to trade on this programmable ledger with the same assets. I think everybody has the idea in mind. If by time T5, one of the investors has not met the terms of the smart contract, then the smart contract will recognize that this fact, and it will return whatever asset has been pledged to the smart contract by the other investor. So here's the rub. On international financial market principles, for example, CPMI IOSCO Principle 9, we should not be settling these large financial transactions in a multi-trillion-dollar treasury market with stablecoins, at least as currently envisioned, or with commercial bank deposits. Rather, under international principles, when the customer of a bank, in this case, in this diagram, customer 3 of bank 2 wants to make a wholesale financial market payment to customer 4 of bank 3, they're not going to settle that transaction in commercial bank money. They're going to have the banks make those payments in central bank money, as you can see in the schematic diagram. So the flow of funds is that customer 3 at bank 2 will ask the bank to use funds from its commercial bank deposit account or margin account over to bank 3 for credit to its customer 4. Let me repeat that. You can see from the flow of orange money, which is commercial bank money, and the flow of green money, which is central bank money, that the trade is ultimately settled via a transfer of commercial bank of central bank money. Without that, if this is happening on large financial market infrastructure, there's the threat of a sudden stop in financial markets when there's any doubt about the value of the underlying money that's being used for settling these large transactions. So under CPMI IOSCO principles, the ultimate settlement should depend on central bank money so that there's no doubt. It's not a question of whether the money is close in value to $1. You want the literal unit of account, the dollar uh, that the central bank itself provides to the financial system to be used to settle these transactions. So here's how you would do this transaction again with central bank money. You would have the two clearing banks for the two investors, banks A and B, also participating on the programmable ledger. And at time T3, you can see that investor B is going to pledge funds to the smart contract. What it actually does is send a cryptographically signed message that allocates its cash in its commercial bank account to Bank B and then allocates reserves, central bank money held by Bank B to the smart contract. So now that the reserves shown in green on the smart contract are central bank money. And then at time T4, the central bank money is paid to Bank A, which then credits its customer with cash in its commercial bank account. This is all feasible on a programmable platform like Canton. Just checking the time to make sure we're doing okay. So I think I've tried to make the message clear that for the tokenization of finance to proceed at scale to multi-trillion dollar foreign exchange or bond markets, for the margining of multi-trillion dollar derivatives markets, for securities lending, and for other wholesale financial market applications, where critical financial market infrastructure depends on the value of the underlying cash, there should be no question about that value. Instead, there should be complete trust in the unit of account that's used to make these payments, and that requires either central bank money or something very close to that. Don Wilson and I made a proposal for a super safe stablecoin that would reprice to $1 every day. Even that is not as good as central bank money, as I think Don and I are agreed on that. So someday, this is how it's going to happen. Currently, the European Central Bank is exploring the tokenization of its central bank deposits. The Bank of Canada has conducted Project Samara. The ECB is working on Project Appia. The Bank of England has been working on this problem, although with a different approach. And other central banks are pursuing this. In my view, the Fed should also investigate whether this is possible for the United States. Now, let's turn back to foreign exchange before I complete. This is a diagram produced by Project Agora at the Bank for International Settlements. And this is a perfect application for a programmable ledger to process a cross-border payment, including the foreign exchange, the checking of the documents involving KYC, AML, countering the financing of terrorism, sanctions avoidance, and so on. And this chain of banks that are connected on this platform with the benefit of programmability of the money and record keeping uh, allows smart contracts to process cross-border payments far more efficiently than they are today. This is very well explained in the Project Agora white paper. This project has been done with a large number of international banks, global banks, and central banks. Someday this will happen, But as I said, I don't think it's going to happen without a much sounder uh, form of money for the processing of large wholesale cross-border payments. And to do that, we're going to need central banks to tokenize their reserves or provide other means for access to their cash on programmable ledgers. One thing that's missing in Project Agora is how the market participants agree with each other on the terms, the fees, and the foreign exchange rates that are paid along the chain. And this is now a multi-agent contracting problem where if one of the banks agrees to its trade before the others have, then it may end up in a position it doesn't want and may have to reverse that trade. So what we ideally want is not only atomic settlement of the payments along the chain, but also atomic agreement to the initial terms of trade. And in some recent research with Professor Chaojun Wang at the University of Pennsylvania, we have shown that there exists a smart contract-based trade negotiation protocol that allows a programmable ledger uh, to be used to conduct not only the transfers and document checks, but also the negotiation of the trade in an efficient way. And I think in the interest of time, I'm not going to walk through the remaining slides, which you can access uh, later. But we our results show that you will get efficient terms of trade immediately agreed and atomic agreement, then atomic settlement of the trade uh, if if you exploit the power of smart contracting, which means all or none agreement to all of the transactions before any market participant is committed. So, for example, if Dan Oury is trading with me and I'm worried about the terms that I'll get from Kelly Matheson, then the protocol would be that Dan will propose terms to me. I will propose terms to Kelly, but nobody is committed to the proposed terms. Each of us will click a green light, and the green light will commit us irrevocably if and only if everyone along the chain also clicks the green light, and then we're in. Otherwise, uh, there's no trade, and we can renegotiate. In equilibrium, it turns out we'll immediately negotiate on efficient terms. Long, I think I've given you my sense of what the tokenization of finance may look like and the fact that it can't proceed at scale until we have a form of cash settlement that meets international agreed standards for safety and financial stability. With that,
Got
I'm
it.
going to pass the baton back to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Daryl. So let me quickly say what I have learned a bit. The first is that you point out that the promise of this is unlikely to really happen domestically until we have a killer app. And seems international wise is showing more progress. That's one point you pointed if I get it. Then you talk about most fundamentally there's this trust issue of the money thing, and so as you point out in the end. But I have a question here. So uh, you see, I'm not sure you are suggesting that a central bank, the CBDC, the central bank issued currency, would that solve the problem? But we know in the United States, actually, this is banned. Uh, and other countries are like EU or probably China take a different approach. So, what is your take on this?
Okay, so first, yes, the United States has banned the development of a CBDC. I don't even use the letters C, B, D, and C because they're kind of toxic in the US environment because of the politics of central bank digital currencies. I would talk rather about tokenized reserves, which are not
Ah,
available. not available to the general public. And you'll notice that in the diagram, in the schematic diagrams that I just presented, nobody but banks are touching the tokenized reserves. Only banks are permitted to hold those tokenized reserves. So it's not a CBDC. It doesn't threaten privacy of citizens.
Uh,
Uh, the EU or the European Central Bank, for example, is pursuing both the retail CBDC, but only for small wallets without paying interest, not suitable for finance. And it's also pursuing wholesale tokenized reserves, which only banks could hold in principle, and which would, in principle, pay interest at the deposit rate offered by the central bank. So I think most central banks will eventually do this. The Fed might be one of the last because of the unique nature of US politics and the Fed. But I think the US central bank would also eventually issue tokenized reserves. There are other workarounds that I've talked to Kelly about on the side, and I want to pursue with her, but I'm not prepared to go far into that today.
so the final question, because you won't be here in the end. So do you think we are close to a solution on the money, the trust issue you're talking about, or just trying different ways? You're talking about the challenge, but I'm not sure about the solution.
Right. The challenge is timing. So for now, tokenized finance is still small. I mean, in relative terms, it's a small fraction of the total, and it's not a question of financial stability yet. But this will become a bottleneck in the development of tokenized finance. It won't reach its full and natural potential for improving efficiency until this bottleneck is resolved by proper money for the financial system. The, so it's going to be, let's say, 5 to 10 years. And in the meantime, central banks are developing, the Fed is kind of behind, but central banks are developing methodologies for handling this problem. The Bank of England has an approach. The Bank of Canada has an approach. The European Central Bank has an approach. The Bank of Japan is making good progress. The People's Bank of China is making good progress, at least for foreign exchange. So I believe this problem will be resolved and probably won't hold up the development of tokenized finance too much because that's going to proceed quite slowly. There are network effects. Nobody wants to do this until most others are doing it.
Okay, thank you, Daryl. So in the interest of time, let's move on to the second speaker. The next speaker is Miss Kelly Mathewson. Kelly is the Chief Business Development Officer at Digital Asset, where she plays a vital role in the development of the Canton network. So let's hear a frontline industry perspective on the progress, the pace, and the challenges. So the floor is yours, Kelly.
And can I just check? Can you see my screen?
Yes, looks good.
Okay.
Maybe you can enlarge it.
Oh, sorry. Give me 1 second. Let me try and do it. Give me 1 second.
It's clear enough.
It's clear now. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for having me here. I look forward to the conversation. So before we begin talking about tokenization or blockchain technology, and it's so kind of Daryl to make some comments on it, I'd like to start with a much more fundamental question. Why has this topic become so important over the last few years? Financial markets rarely adopt new technology simply because it is new or different. They rarely spend time or money on a solution that has not played itself out in the marketplace with any certainty. So what is it that's causing financial markets to want to take a look at this technology and to actually give it time and attention? And I would say over the past 15 years or so, the demands placed on financial markets have changed significantly. Following the global financial crisis, regulatory reforms such as Basel III increased capital requirements and liquidity requirements. More derivatives are cleared centrally. Uncleared margin rules require firms to exchange collateral across a much broader range of transactions. More recently, higher interest rates have made high quality collateral economically valuable once again. And so at the same time, private markets, I think, continue to grow, and institutional participation in digital assets has increased over time. So global investors, global traders, global hedgers are all increasingly expecting markets to operate well beyond the traditional business hours. And all of these trends have one thing in common. They have increased the demand for liquidity and financing. And that in turn means that they increase the demand for collateral. What's interesting, however, is that the world's not running out of collateral. As Daryl mentioned in his portion, there's 300 trillion of assets just in the US. Most of those are high quality liquid assets. When you add that up, there's about 300 trillion of high quality liquid assets around the globe. Government bonds, different treasury instruments, and the like. Yet industry studies will consistently estimate that only around 10% of those assets are actively mobilized to support financing and liquidity. So the challenge isn't a shortage of assets. The challenge is in how those assets can move efficiently to meet the market demand. And many of the existing infrastructure in banks and broker dealers and financial market entities, CCPs and CSDs, is just not sort of up for that challenge at this moment in time. In fact, today's market infrastructure has evolved, over many decades. Securities settle according to local market hours or regional hours. Payment systems have operating windows. Different countries operate obviously in different time zones. Custodians and central security depositories operate on different operational processes and legal frameworks. And so none of these individual systems are broken. In fact, they arguably work extremely well to some degree, but collectively across the globe, they create friction. Assets can often not move when they're needed. Firms, therefore, often compensate holding excess collateral by pre-positioning securities around the globe before markets open, maintaining ledger and liquidity buffers that they would ideally like to have and be using in other more effective revenue generating activities. And so the collateral gets fragmented across multiple custodians, multiple jurisdictions, multiple time zones. Another challenge is I would say, visibility. Even the world's largest financial institutions often do not have a complete real-time picture of where all their collateral resides across legal entities, where all of their assets reside in a usable form. Custodians and markets have assets and collateral sort of spread out in different jurisdictions. And a considerable amount of effort is still spent simply trying to determine what assets are available and where they can be used. And so this is where tokenization begins to matter. I think it's important to think about tokenization the right way. Tokenization is not simply the process of creating a digital version of an existing security. Daryl talked about this. It's really important for it to be the actual asset, not a derivative of the asset, not a digital twin of the asset, not a trust certificate of the asset. It has to be the asset that's actually represented on chain. We refer to it as creating an authoritative digital representation or a digital record of an asset that can participate in an entirely new operating model in financial markets. And it makes it easier to identify those assets, makes it easier to mobilize them, makes it easier to finance them, easier to use them across multiple jurisdictions. So I think creating a digital asset via tokenization doesn't automatically create economic value. The value comes from what that asset can do after it has been tokenized. And that brings us naturally to the next question on my next slide, which is, if tokenization is not the tokenization is not the end goal, then what is? Okay. I sometimes describe tokenization as solving the representation problem, the representation of the asset. It transforms a financial asset from a traditional record into a digitally represented programmable asset. And that's an important innovation for sure. But it does not by itself transform the financial markets. And let me explain what I mean by that. imagine taking a paper document and converting it into a PDF. Then that document has, by definition, become digital. But the underlying business processes has not fundamentally changed in any way. A real transformation, I would submit respectfully, occurs when that document becomes part of an entirely new digital workflow. And I believe that same principle, as we're discussing here today with this wonderful audience and group of minds around the globe, is I believe that same principle applies to financial assets. If a tokenized government bond sitting quietly in a digital wallet and doing nothing in the secondary markets, I mean, that's certainly interesting, but a tokenized government bond that can immediately support a repo transaction, as we have done over the course of the past year, to satisfy margin requirements, to move between financial applications, to settle automatically with digital cash and be used and reused later again that same day. Well, that's transformational. That's the value that's not created by tokenization alone. It's created by the economic activity that tokenization enables. And the distinction, I think, is critically important because discussions about digital assets often focused almost entirely, at least up until the last year or so, on issuance, when in reality, issuance is really just the first step. Secondary markets, as I've sort of alluded to in my comments so far, is where financial markets really create most of their value. Trading, financing, securities lending, collateral management, and asset servicing, treasury management, payments, liquidity management. These are the activities that determine how productive an asset becomes throughout its lifetime. And so one observation I've made over the last several years, but increasingly more in the last couple of years as we've worked with DTCC and others around the globe, is that financial markets have spent the past 50 or so years optimizing transactions. We've built arguably remarkable systems for trading, matching, confirm, settling transactions. In separate duplicative silos around the globe. So I would submit that the next decade will be about optimizing those assets themselves. Historically, assets have been relatively passive in the process of workflow. They sit safely in custody, they occasionally move, they generate income, but by and large, they're static records. I think what's different is that digital assets are not static records. To the point of your introduction, they become programmable economic objects. They can finance, they can satisfy margin, they can support securities lending, they can move globally on a moment's notice, they can interact with multiple independent financial applications. They become, as assets and as instruments themselves, significantly more productive, and they enable that productivity. They are enabling that productivity by requiring tokenization. And moving beyond that, it requires the networks that support that. So if I could, for just a minute, networks allow these independent applications to communicate with one another while each institution continues to operate under its own governance, its own regulatory framework, its own commercial model. Interoperability, therefore, becomes critically important. Otherwise, we're still just we're creating a new world of these separate duplicative operating silos. So I would note that interoperability is frequently misunderstood, or it's usually focused on as being a network to network matter. It's not simply by moving tokens from one blockchain to another. Rather, it's about enabling independent financial applications, and an application from DTCC in the US or JSCC in Japan or the TMX in Canada or Euroclear and Clearstream in the UK and the EU, enabling independent financial applications to coordinate complex multi-party workflows while each continues to maintain its own business rules, its own jurisdictional, regulatory, and legal governance, and its own privacy requirements. I will say that what ultimately emerges is not just simply a collection of tokenized assets. What emerges is a digital financial network, I would submit, where trading, settlement collateral, where risk management and asset servicing remain synchronized in real time, where markets become connected workflows rather than disconnected processes. And that naturally will lead to where you would go next. If we're building this type of financial infrastructure, what characteristics must that infrastructure provide in order for institutions to be able to trust it? So what matters in a ledger for financial markets, and I am going to lean a little bit on the ledger that I know here, which is Canton, but I would submit to you that the comments that I make are not solely about that one blockchain, but would apply to any of the digital networks that will undoubtedly become successful around the globe. What I would say is that financial markets are among, we all know this, financial markets are among the most regulated and risk sensitive or risk aware industries in the world. As a result, the characteristics required of financial infrastructure are very different from those required for consumer applications or even public payment systems to some degree. I would highlight four characteristics that I believe are essential, and it's a little bit misleading because there's three on the page, but let me go with the fourth and I'll tie it together. So the first is mobility. Assets must move efficiently across institutions, across jurisdictions and applications while preserving the legal certainty and operational resilience of the entities that are party to a transaction with those assets. If those digital assets cannot move more effectively than traditional assets, then we've not solved anything in the form of an underlying problem. We've, been the proverbial hammer searching for a nail and created a solution for a problem that didn't exist. So the second one is where it becomes critically important when thinking about a digital ecosystem, which is privacy. Privacy and transparency are not the opposites. I actually often find this curious when I talk to a crypto audience that tends to assume that transparency is the ultimate and privacy is what you should try to avoid or is a negative or a risk. But regulators require transparency. Market participants require transparency or confidentiality of their terms. Good financial infrastructure supports both it supports both simultaneously by ensuring each participant can only see the information necessary for its role, while, say, a regulator or supervisory authority or an auditor retains the right to have appropriate oversight. So privacy is key, is essential. I might actually submit to you that privacy is what enables trust in financial markets because it allows for the certainty of knowing that only those entitled to know the terms and conditions of a transaction are in fact those that actually have it. And the third is sovereignty. I think this is, or aligned incentives. And I think this is an increasingly important concept as many of the market participants around the globe in this space begin to move from POCs and pilots into actual live production transactions. I think it's an increasingly important topic. Financial institutions, for the most part, do not want to surrender their governance models or their compliance frameworks or their client relationships simply to participate in a network. Every application should retain its own governance or commercial model, should retain its regulatory responsibilities while still interoperating with other applications. And that allows for innovation without forcing every institution into a single operating model. Financial incentives matter. Sustainable financial networks should reward participants for creating genuine economic activity. Builders should be rewarded for developing applications. Network growth should reflect real usage rather than speculation or rather than being driven by social media activity. It should be based in real economic activity that's moving across a new financial ecosystem. So when these characteristics, mobility, privacy, sovereignty, and aligned incentives, so those four that you see represented as three on the page, come together, we begin creating infrastructure that's appropriate for institutional financial markets, for systemically important, highly regulated institutional financial markets. The technology, frankly, and I realize I represent the technology firm, but the technology becomes invisible. It matters instead what markets become as more efficient, more connected, and more productive, and that infrastructure exists, or once that infrastructure exists, we can turn to debating the economic value of different transactions and how tokenization and some of the applications in their new forms of products and services can enable more growth. And so what I would say is what we should be thinking about next is what does the future of that financial market actually look like? And so here's a bit of a discussion that we could have. If we were to build this type of infrastructure, what does success actually look like? Well, if we accept that tokenization creates a digital representation of an asset and that interoperable networks enable assets to move and interact, then the next question becomes, what are we actually trying to build? And in my view, the objective is not simply um, it's not simply about a more efficient settlement system. The objective has to be a more connected financial system. I think that success can be described in the three primary goals you see on the page. The first is unlocking assets that candidly already exist, but unlocking them to have more power and more purpose around the globe. We often speak about creating new digital assets. But the reality is that financial markets already contain extraordinary amounts of value, government bonds, equities, corporate debt, and the like. The challenge isn't in creating more assets. The challenge is in enabling those assets to participate more effectively in the financial ecosystem. Historically, increasing collateral mobility was often required firms to move those securities physically between custodians or central securities depositories, and that creates operational complexity and cost and settlement risk, and frequently requires institutions to change their long-standing custody relationships. I don't believe that's going to be the future of this. I think that we're separating as we go forward asset safekeeping from asset mobility, not as in separate topics, but not tying them to be inextricably linked together. The asset can remain exactly where it is today, but you can begin to have the ability to participate in financing, collateral, and liquidity activities around the globe on a more immediate and real-time basis by not having to shift the asset around from a safekeeping perspective. The second goal is about improving capital efficiency. Every major financial institution is focused on balance sheet optimization. Capital has become, or is always increasingly valuable, it just gets more and more valuable over time. Liquidity gets more and more valuable over time. And institutions can mobilize more collateral without issuing more. If institutions could mobilize more collateral without using more capital, they could create greater financing capability from exactly the same amount of balance sheet. And so this is where I think tokenization is not fundamentally a technical discussion. It becomes a liquidity and a balance sheet discussion as well. And then the third objective is creating network rather than creating monopoly. If we just simply move to one new system, we're not creating, or if we're enabling someone because they have a technological lock on the market, we're not perpetuating the good form of competitive and capitalistic landscape that has defined financial markets for decades. So there's no reason that digital markets should eliminate the specialization that occurs across FMIs and CSDs and custodians and FinTechs. Institutions should remain independent, competition should remain healthy and vibrant, innovation should continue, but interoperability among those organizations is the challenge and is the responsibility of the network provider. That's where we're providing a critical and essential role to enabling those institutions that operate their sovereign products and services to have an interconnected ecosystem where data can move seamlessly across them that provides for that interoperability and preserves the privacy. So those, I say, would be some of the goals of the global financial network. Let's drill a little bit into one of the points that I just made on the cost of inefficient balance sheet use. It was the middle one on the prior slide. And I know all of the goals are equally important, but it's where it actually hits the financial market participants the most. If they can get more efficient balance sheet use, either as a provider of services or as a receiver of services, then I think that's ultimately what starts to fuel the fire of adoption across the industry. Arguably, it's what we're seeing in the U.S. market, as some of us were chatting about before the session even began. So I said, I represent the technology firm or a network firm, but even I would be the first to admit that technology rarely alone changes financial markets. Economics is what changes financial markets. Today, one of the most valuable resources within every bank is balance sheet capacity within every broker-dealer. Yet, a surprising amount of that capacity is effectively trapped, not because institution lacks assets, but because regulations rarely require it. And not because regulations rarely require it, they do all the time, but because today's infrastructure makes collateral difficult to move quickly and confidently, and balance sheet is often what comes in behind that to prop it up. So consider how collateral is managed today. Institutions maintain excess collateral because they can't always be certain that assets will arrive exactly when needed. They pre-position securities overnight because settlement systems operate according to local business hours. They maintain liquidity buffers based on operational uncertainty rather than on economic necessity. They fragment collateral across multiple entities, custodians, jurisdictions, because transferring assets rapidly remains operationally complex. And every one of those decisions is rational. Every institution is managing risk responsibly, but collectively, those practices reduce the productive use of balance sheet for each of those institutions and across the industry. Tokenization doesn't eliminate financial risk, nor frankly should it. Instead, it eliminates the operational friction so that when collateral becomes digitally represented and connected across interoperable applications, delivery versus payment can occur atomically. We saw that in some of Darrell's slides. Institutions can gain confidence that assets will arrive when exactly required. Liquidity becomes available when it's needed rather than pre-funded hours or even days in advance. It can be available on more of a moment's notice. Most importantly, the same asset can potentially support multiple financing transactions throughout the day. It can be used for a couple hours and then a couple of minutes and then not in the normal cycle of a minimum of a day. I believe when you focus on this, the next decade will be, as I said earlier, about optimizing assets. It will be about supporting changes in ownership in real time. It'll be about programming an economic outcome or an economic asset servicing process on an asset. It'll be about supporting repo financing 24/7, about being able to meet margin calls intraday and moments after that call has been made. It'll be about supporting greater securities lending. That productivity isn't just simply the digitization of the asset. It's where the economic transformation of that asset begins. And that is ultimately what I think is writing the cost of an inefficient balance sheet use by allowing for assets to have greater utility and to be used much more efficiently. And that's what tokenization doesn't solve directly in and of itself, but it enables that asset to become a dynamic asset and used more efficiently around the globe. And so what's the impact of that? Just to give you some very specific numbers and talk less in the theoretical and more in what we're actually seeing in the actual market right now.
Sorry,
And
Kelly, you
yes,
have 1 minute.
Oh, yes, sorry. Yes, this is the last slide. Although individual estimates vary, industry analysis points are remarkably consistent on this. If you are able to free trapped capacity across a balance sheet, you can gain the utility of that in the order of 30 to 35%. There's many studies out there, but this is what we're seeing as the markets that we're working with are going live. And you gain by having assets gain the ability to be reused more and more in a 24/7 cycle. Ultimately, we're seeing capacity improve by about 30 to 50% across the markets. And all of this then starts to change that scenario of being less about a technological change and more about the economic impact of mobilizing assets and making them more active and more available across markets. And it's starting to have a real balance sheet impact in the order of 30 to 50%. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly. So really, thank you for the fantastic perspectives. And let me quickly summarize among the other things, the four things I learned, and each of them seems to attach a question quickly. Now, the first, I think you talk about there's this demand for the liquidity and collateral outside of the traditional hours. My question here is that does that qualify as a killer app, as Daryl has suggested, or maybe not? I'm not. So that's first question. The
I,
second thing, I think, let me finish this.
yeah,
The
please.
second thing is that you emphasize that they should be actual digital assets. So if they are, and they can be used that way, does that solve the problem Daryl worry about? The trust of the money, stuff like that, if I'm not mistaken. That's the second part. The third is that I talk about the importance of the infrastructure and the features of that. You even talk about the global financial system in the new technology-driven framework. Now, but the world we know is that is so divergent. So, do you perceive a global financial network, or you think we're far from that? At what stage we are? Finally, you talk about the balance sheet capacity. You talk about the future is about optimizing the assets. So that seems to be another part of this killer app. But I'm wondering how far we are from that, bettering the pace.
Yeah, I'll give
Thank.
you a quick answer on each. In terms of the killer app, I really think it depends on which market participant type you are for what will be killer for you. But I really do believe that as important as tokenization is to bring the assets into the financial ecosystem, the killer app is, or killer apps, are those apps in the secondary market that are then doing something with those on-chain assets, on-chain securities or on-chain cash. So I don't know if it's one app so much as it could be DVP purchases and sales for hedging and investing purposes, or it could be repo financing or collateral management. But I do think that it is the use of those assets in the secondary market that is going to sort of light the fire, if you will, on adoption, which is probably my answer to the fourth question. In terms of the second question you have, and on to Daryl's point on having the actual asset on chain. Yes, actually, and Daryl knows this and has actually been a great industry mind that contributed a lot to frame our thinking about this and ultimately led to DTCC as a first example of making a very different approach to this. But it is about having the U.S. Treasury or the U.S. equity on chain. It's not a wrapper. It is not a claim. It is not a derivative. I think that's not an app so much. I wouldn't use the word killer app for that, but I think that's the killer solution. That is the pivotal change in how this technology is being used that I think is going to be adopted by different organizations around the globe because it is what enables someone to have the same frame of reference to that asset that they have in the TradFi market, but now with the ability to use it in a more a real-time way. On the question of I forget. What was the third question? The third question was about
Global financial
oh, the
system.
global financial system, sorry. And then the last one was on balance sheet. On the global financial system, I do, to be honest with you, I don't want to put the weight of the world on seeing the DTCC come to market in the October timeframe and argue that the US is driving the way forward. That is not at all what my comment is. But I do think it is the first major financial market to put its assets on chain and make it available for the market participants to use. I do think, given the size and the utility of US denominated US assets, we will see the start of a global financial market, but one market does not make a global financial market, however big it might be. I do think we are starting to see out of Japan, out of Hong Kong, out of the UK, out of the EU, and out of Canada in particular, a very rapid onboarding after the US market. And that I think I will put down here, and hopefully we can check with each other in a year or so. I think that we will see a rather dramatic change over the next year. And the last point I'll make is because that balance sheet impact. I think in the end of the day, it's all a science experiment unless or until it changes liquidity and balance sheet efficiency for organizations that are participating. And we are seeing real numbers as the 30 to 50% recommended that are starting to drive that. And frankly, when it hits your balance sheet and hits it in a positive way, you know then you're going to be doing more of it, and that will drive adoption.
Okay. Finally, a one sentence question. So, should we measure the progress by the activity of the stable coin or not?
No, I actually think that we should manage the progress by the activity, the transactional activity that occurs in a network, whether that's using on-chain securities or on-chain cash and liquidity, which could be stable coins, tokenized deposits, or money markets. We should be looking for the capital markets to be active on-chain, and that's how we should measure it.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's move on to the third speaker. And the next speaker is Christian Catalini. Christian is the founder of the MIT Crypto Economics Lab and a co-founder of Lightspark. He's also co-creator of Dime. So actually, Christian just talked at the Lohan Academy's webinar, just talked about AGI, but now he's deeply involved into the crypto economics. So I think he's really a very good person. So we really asked Christian to talk about. We believe that in the agentic economy, AI age, actually we do need blockchain to play a role. They interact with each other, and we'd like to like Christian to spend maybe about 15 minutes to talk about your perspective. Christian, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I will go fairly rapidly, and then we can focus more on question and answers. I'll start by talking about AI, and then I'll get back to digital assets and the potential intersection of these two major trends. So on the AI side, I think it all has to start by focusing on what is the key bottleneck in an age of increasingly powerful artificial intelligence. Some may argue we already have some distributed forms of artificial general intelligence for some of the tasks like coding and math. There's a long history, and I think theorizing in academia, and probably the most influential book was the book by Agrawal, Gans, and Goldfarb that identified human judgment as the key complement to artificial intelligence. More recently, I think you've heard a lot of very vague terms for really define what is the residual for humans. Some people call it taste, some people call it curation, some people call it judgment. All of these terms are somewhat imprecise, and so back in June of last year, we went on a journey to try to really come up with something more precise. And where we landed was a very simple idea. The models that we have today, as well as future iteration like word models that we're seeing people like Dr. Fei-Fei Li or Yan LeCun speak of, essentially have a very simple property. Anything that can be measured will be automated. We already witnessed some cycles of this. And in fact, ImageNet, which is the benchmarking competition that launched all of this, was essentially a big data breakthrough, just essentially collecting enough labeled data to allow neural nets to show their power. And in this loop between data, being able to point these models at a reward, which can be explicit or implicit, and then throwing compute at it, essentially, Sutton's bitter lesson, we're discovering that these models are a lot more flexible than what we expected. We started with, having humans label images and text, and that being kind of the fuel for this. Now you're seeing frontier labs like OpenAI and others essentially form joint ventures with industry leaders, all the way to the creative arts, A24 with Google DeepMind, or hiring, Wall Street grant workers to train the next iterations of these models. So where's really that distinction between what's measurable to the machine and what's measurable to the humans? We go into a lot more detail in our paper on the economics of AGI, which you can find online. But the intuition is fairly simple. There's a gap between what humans can measure. Think about all the sum of experiences you've had since you were born, through your career, through every kind of out of distribution sample that you were able to observe, which is really the difference when you think about it between a seasoned expert and a junior, and what the machines can measure, right? They've ingested all humanly available text online and a lot more books and so on. But there's a gap between those two. And so the part that the machines can measure, it's what's being automated right now. What is still in people's brains, the weight, the unique neural network that you're running when you're thinking about any topic, that is still defensible and inherently human. Now, what's kind of fascinating, and this is of a few days ago, you're seeing this collaboration where human expertise gets codified, is really leading to the next breakthroughs in performance. And so it seems to be a very credible trend that as we measure more, as we bring more of these unmeasured into these models, we're able really to replicate more and more of humans' work. In this particular case, it was Bridgewater collaborating with thinking machines, and their model that brings in expert judgment, expert verification in the loop, where the expert really decides, is this a good output or not, and keeps training kind of the next iteration, severely outperforms most frontier models examined in this particular analysis. Now, again, if you believe that there's going to be a measurability gap between what we can measure and what the machines can measure, that opens up all sort of interesting policy questions. And also, as we start deploying agents into society, whether they're doing payments, they're engaging in transaction, of course, they're already trading. Probably one of the earliest application of agents is in finance and in decentralized finance. There's going to be risk, right? Because there's going to be situations where humans cannot really measure and cannot really know for sure that the model is following human intent. And so in the paper, we define this concept of a verifiable share. The verifiable share is the part of agentic output that humans can actually stand behind, that humans can verify, that human know, doesn't really present, some weird preferences of the AI or something that really doesn't follow the initial instructions. Right now, this share is decreasing, and we'll unpack why. And I would argue this is probably the most important policy issue when you're thinking about the impact of AI on society, is understanding the gap between, again, what we think are our preferences, our initial intentions when you're operating these systems, and what comes out on the other end. Now, what's interesting is that, of course, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Besson has this really interesting paper on the automation that followed the looms introduction in textiles. And the looms really increased productivity dramatically for of course, producing textiles, but the humans were the bottleneck, right? So verification of what was coming out of the machines was really what limited some of the productivity gains in the early years. And it wasn't until that old flow was redesigned that we really benefited from what is kind of modern textiles. So this problem of babysitting the slop, of making sure that agentic output really follows human intent, is one that is really old, and we're seeing kind of in new forms, of course, much more severe and accelerated forms with artificial intelligence. Now, many have kind of picked up on some of the concepts of the paper that we've published back in February. Satya Nadella from Microsoft, for example, has defined this critical concept of feedback loops, where essentially companies are retaining their core IP, their core capabilities, by feeding back information into the system and retaining that information. And then, a similar on the venture capital side, an investor has defined this class of the untrainable, the jobs that the machines cannot really do because they can't really measure. So this whole idea of verification being the key bottleneck is kind of traveling through the economy really rapidly. If you believe that, verification in a world with cheap execution, cheap automation, verification really becomes the key bottleneck, and we can talk more about why I don't believe AI can verify AI, especially for these edge cases. You're rapidly confronted with two different cost curves. The cost of automation really reacts to compute, reacts to new models, reacts to kind of the discovery, again, inspired by the bitter lesson from Sutton, that throw more compute at the problem, better data, you get much better results out. And then the human verification process is still pretty biologically bounded. It's based on our ability to really babysit the machines. And of course, the longer the feedback loop between the agentic output and us knowing, is this a good decision? Think about a policy decision or institutional design decision. The more challenging this gap between humans and machines can become over time. And again, some of this is already playing out. Look no further than coding and engineering. These are the fields that are adapting this very aggressively. We went from April of last year, where we were saying 30% of the code is written by AI, to now saying more than 75, if not all the code is written by AI. And recently, with discussions around recursive self-improvement, a lot of companies really starting to think about, okay, will Claude write the next iteration of Claude? Are we going to be in a rapid takeoff zone where agentic output feeds new agentic output without human in the loop? And of course, this is a side effect, right? So here you have an example from China and an example from the US. Company that's supposed to be focused on cybersecurity ships, private key with one of its releases. Amazon having to call back all of its, engineers and saying no more AI generated code. Let's stop the brakes. Let's pay a lot more attention about where we're shipping. And the economics here work kind of in the wrong direction, which is there's an incentive to increase and accelerate automation, even if it cannot be fully verified, because everybody's in this massive race, both geopolitically and between different firms, to adopt AI as quickly as possible. In the paper, we go into a lot more detail, but essentially, you can divide the economy into 4 quadrants, depending on what is the cost of verifying that the output is accurate versus the cost of automating it. Now, the green zone is the great one where, verification is cheap. Think about math, coding, a number of fields where we can build very, very good evals. And so AI can rapidly progress towards state of the art. And the most dangerous quadrant, of course, is the upper left, where cost of automation is low, but cost of verification is high, and we may kind of take shortcuts either as a firm, an individual, or as society in what kind of code gets deployed. And this is going to be particularly important, of course, for financial services, where, of course, the stakes are particularly high. Now, really rapidly, how will the market potentially evolve in this? I think, of course, a market for lemons where people are shipping agentic output without verification is not sustainable. And so you're seeing early signs of what we called in the paper liability as a service. So switching from a model where software is sold as is, software as a service, to a model where companies will stand behind the agentic output, they will insure it. So Cognition is an example. On the developer side, 11 Labs started insuring their audio agents. I think as we switch from a model where you just buy AI, you buy agentic output, to one where you kind of want to work on the other side of the equation, expect many more companies to kind of ensure that outcome. And this is going to be particularly important, of course, in payments, where no one is going to use an agentic agent for commerce if they don't know that's going to act on the original intent and within safeguards. The other debate that I think is quite relevant, especially to FinTech, is one that, again, was inspired by Satya Nadella's recent article on this, where essentially he's questioning, do we want a world where a couple of foundational labs are essentially absorbing all of the work, right? Is all of this being absorbed by a few entities, or do we want a much more distributed forms of intelligence? And I think firms are now realizing that because verification is essentially the moment where you're really creating the secret source of an organization, that's the most valuable part not to delegate out. And I think firms will pay a lot more attention to building their own verification stack so that they can essentially not only retain the inputs and the expertise of the people working for them, but also all of the organizational learnings, all the databases of failure. Those are extremely powerful and useful for training advanced models. So look at the work that Visa and Stripe and others have done in agentic commerce and in general in fraud detection and alike. If that gets fed back to the foundational labs, then of course these companies are on a much more weaker footing. If it's retained at the firm, I think we're going to see competition shape very differently, at least in financial services. That said, I mean, as you can see, both on Codex or Cloud Cowork, the foundation labs are trying to expand the kind of data they collect, the traces, the interactions that they see. And of course, that's just better measurement, right? And so if you can observe the work of a compliance officer, of an accounting officer, or anyone else in a firm, you can essentially start to replicate what they actually do with these models. And of course, when it comes to the future of finance, you're seeing both entry by the foundational labs on the consumer side. On the left, you have OpenAI's ChatGPT Finance. And on the B2B side, agents for financial services from Anthropic. Again, these are just two examples, but more broadly, these labs are striking partnerships and they're expanding their reach into financial services more broadly. So that's kind of what's happening on the AI side. I will now rapidly shift gears to the digital asset side before kind of wrapping. On the digital asset side, I would say if you take a 30,000 feet perspective, really zooming out, if the Silk Roads were the network that made the trade of goods really low cost, the web was kind of the network that made the trade of information really low cost. Open protocols such as Bitcoin, Ethereum, and everything after that are the open networks that are going to reshape how finance is evolving. And here I have strong opinions. I think a lot of the efforts of creating much more curated experiences, whether they're corporate ones or collaboration between different governments like the FinTernet, are going to end up the same way, American Online, Apple eWord, or Microsoft Network ended against the internet. There's a radical force of these open networks in driving competition and innovation, and I think in the end, it's what's going to shape really the ultimate outcome. Of course, we heard from Daryl a lot of the concerns around kind of tokenization and how to do it properly. That will have to be implemented, so it's not just going to be completely open and permissionless, but these much more curated approaches, I think, are going to be just too slow to cope with the progress happening on the more open side. And so I do think actually stablecoin are interesting, mostly because they're the canary in the coal mine for how evolution in payments and financial services is going to play out over the near term. Now, there's a lot of misconceptions about stablecoins. I've written a length about it. I would say, the main use case today is really dollarization, especially if you look at the leading stablecoin, which is Tether. This is probably not the status quo. I was engaged with many regulators across the globe in the Libra Day, and they were, of course, extremely concerned about what's the response to dollarization. So I don't think we're in equilibrium, but we're in an interesting phase of infrastructure inversion. We're essentially using these assets to drive the car on the road that's designed for horses, or for those of you who remember the sound of the modem trying to use a telephone line that was designed for audio to pass data. So when you look at stablecoin, just picture these two examples for understanding where we are in the adoption curve. Stablecoins are being used to do stablecoin sandwiches, which are essentially ways to connect great domestic real-time payment systems with each other. Here again, Tether is dominant in terms of liquidity, in terms of spread. It's not ideal, right? You're going from fiat to stablecoin to fiat. It's kind of a stopgap measure until the entire system can be tokenized. And of course, with great efforts on tokenizing all sort of assets, this is going to become a lot more efficient. The other use case that is kind of nascent is B2B payments. So this is kind of, again, corporate treasurers and others. They're trying to move value between different systems. How do you move value on Friday, London time, when the banks are closed, to New York with final settlement? Of course, pre-funding is a concern, but the systems are really gluing this all together in a sort of patchwork system. Now, I don't have time to delve into this, but people have often debated, do these stablecoins really have network effects? I think with MiCA, with Genius, and of course regulation coming on, they're actually fully commoditized. I mean, the whole point of regulation in this space is to make these stablecoins interchangeable, make them fungible, make them good money, make them trustworthy. And so what you're seeing is competition is shifting elsewhere. Stripe launching Tempo, Circle launching Arc, networks like Canton and others. Different players are essentially trying to own the infrastructure infrastructure, the rails, which is of course different than the original intent of these open networks, because they understand that the asset per se is not really monetizable. And probably the most salient example is, the recent event of a few days ago, when 140 plus institutions essentially came together with what should be an open standard for stablecoin issuance that really resembles a lot Libra. Maybe they'll make the same mistakes and the project will not succeed. But you can see that there's this push and pull between decentralization and coordination around open standards in this space. So really briefly, I know I only have a couple of minutes. How do these two major trends come together? Essentially AI on one side and verification, and ensuring that these agents are trustworthy, and everything happening in the tokenization space, from stablecoins to tokenized deposits and a lot more. Every payments innovation is essentially and has been an innovation in absorbing liability and taking risk away to ensure adoption and success. I mean, these are Western examples. I'm sure there's equivalent examples around the globe. The credit card really making consumer comfortable, and then eBay kind of making PayPal and online commerce viable, and things like Amazon Prime that make it really easy for people to buy without worrying about the consequences. I think there's a similar opportunity in the agentic commerce space to ensure that if these agents are acting on behalf of individuals and companies, whatever the outcome is can be stand behind. So companies can stand behind that and can be kind of insured and supported. Again, the market is very nascent. The volumes are really small. And I think there's a broader misunderstanding of incumbents versus new entrants. I think AI has been often an incumbent reinforcing technology for obvious reasons, including data modes and network effects and distribution. In this space, I think if you think about any payment that exists today, I think the incumbents will own that. But there's also new types of payments that I think are going to emerge that may be lending themselves more to, stable coins, crypto rails, and tokenized assets. The agentic stack, when it comes to payments and commerce, is of course very complex, right? Because these agents not only need to communicate, you need to be able to trust them, you need to give them a mandate so that they can do and perform a job. And so back to the paper on the economics of AGI, I think all of the value will really accrue to the type of companies that can lower the risk and make sure that if you're relying on one of these agents to perform a payment, it's going to be kind of insured. It's going to be something that you can trust along the way. I'll close with this slide where essentially, I think when you look on the left, I think any payment that exists today, fundamentally, existing card networks, existing payment system will probably do a pretty good job, especially in partnership with some of the foundational labs. You will see, chat conversation turn into a commerce conversation. So any sort of payment experience that exists today doesn't need programmability, doesn't need stablecoins, doesn't need any new rails. And that's going to be the bulk of it. But what's kind of interesting is these new types of machine-to-machine payments. The web is probably undergoing one of the biggest challenges since its creation. Agents crawl all sort of resources. In fact, today, at least in the US, if you do a search, most of the time you're now presented with an AI summary. That means traffic isn't going to the creators of content anymore. But more broadly, I think as machines and agents will need to procure the right resources, the right ground truth, to even perform verification, you will see a thriving marketplace for data. And so when it comes to machine payments, that's where probably stablecoins, tokenized assets, and programmability will play a bigger role. But to wrap up, again, I think if you intersect these two trends, on one side, tokenization, bringing online new types of assets that weren't tradable, weren't executable 24/7 before, with how AI is really changing some of the economics between execution and verification, it's really clear that we're living in an extremely interesting time. And on one side, a lot of the technology is really incumbent reinforcing. So I would expect a lot more that on existing use cases, but there's going to be new use cases for machine-to-machine payment, and that's probably where stablecoins and programmability will matter the most. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. I think you've covered a lot. You have covered 25 minutes into 15 minutes. So I guess you started by talking about a critical feature, that is this gap between the human measurability and the machine measurability, and that is a fundamental feature and probably the biggest challenge. And so if we go from that, I think there's a couple of quick questions I want to verify with you. One is that seems to be a principle for governance. So and if that's the case, what do you think your principle talk about? What is the implication for finance? That's first question quickly. Second is that you're talking about verification is crucial. And so how much is that verification should be on-chain related to blockchain? And that seems to be related to your machine between machine payments, stuff like that. But two quick questions.
Yes, I would say on the first one, this is probably where policy and regulation is going to be the most important. I think we're already witnessing it in code. Again, because engineering has been the field that has adopted all of these tools the fastest. Companies are right now shipping code that their CEOs will go publicly saying, "Okay, so much of it is agentically generated." I think that's also a policy concern, right? What happens when banks, financial institutions, and other regulated players ship code that isn't fully verified? More generally, I think we need to think through that gap between the private incentives of firms to ship agentic output and the cost to society of some of these things going wrong. I would say that's probably the most important governance question around bringing powerful AI into all sort of aspects of fintech. We already have agents that will make suggestions or recommendations to individuals on their finances. I think that's mostly net positive, right? The fact that everyone will have access to a very low cost financial advisor and can do financial literacy at their own pace. I think, I tend to think this is mostly positive, but there will be challenges. And so I think that's probably the most important area for policy to focus on. On the second one, again, I think we need to cut through the hype. If you talk to the players in the crypto or stablecoin space, they will tell you the entire future of agentic commerce needs to be on stablecoins because stablecoins are programmable. That's absolutely not true. In fact, I think most consumer and even B2B payments will happily move on traditional rails. A lot of the automation can be done actually at the software level. It doesn't need to be enforced on chain. Where on-chain verification and essentially guardrails become really important is when you're starting to go down different levels of autonomy. So if you think about self-driving as an analogy, and again, all analogies are imperfect, the more autonomy you give to these agents, the extreme version is the agent is an economic agent with full property rights that can make its own decisions and has its own agency, so to speak. Of course, that can only be achieved on chain because you need to be able to endow these agents with essential property rights and their own resources. I think we're very far from, kind of level 5 agentic payments and agents. So I think it's more for the future. When it comes to machine-to-machine payments, but more broadly, when it comes to interoperability, I think we will discover that there's going to be interesting moments where I need to cryptographically verify that something executed in one part of the economic system follows certain rules. And so one of the most promising things also in the tokenization space is not so much networks where I give all the power to a centralized actor. Otherwise, we're just reinventing the card networks. We're just reinventing the same, bottlenecks and market power that we have had for decades. There's going to be moments where people will not want a central actor to coordinate any network with meaningful financial activity on it, whether it's payments or financial services. Now, if it's delivered by the public sector, that's very different. But if you think about private activity, we will not want to have a network where there's an architect. And so when that happens, I do think verification will be important. And it will be important, for example, for financial institution A to verify that when their asset moves under operations by a different financial institution, it still follows all their compliance rules, all their checks and guardrails. That's what verification through cryptographic provenance is going to be really strong. And you're seeing these experiments where you can have private clouds, so to speak, between different networks. Tokenized assets can move between them. But it's not that there's one central actor that controls the keys. I think those designs are very vulnerable. And we've seen recent acts to that matter, where if you give the keys to someone, if they have control, then we're back into the old system.
Okay, thank you very much, Christian. So let's move on to the fourth speaker is Gordon Liao. And Gordon is the chief economist and head of research at Circle. So he's used to be at the Fed, so he understands policy issues, and also he's now at the frontier of pursuing the practice. So I'm gonna cut short, and so Gordon, you have 15 minutes. Go ahead. Great. Thanks so much for the invitation. Let me try to share my slides. 1 second. Difficulty sharing the slides. This is problematic. Zoom is not allowing me to share. I could also go last if it's easier, because I think it's asking me to restart before I can share slides. Oh, are you sure? Yes, because it's okay. That's so in the interest of time, are you sure you want to switch? Or I can just let me just reopen Zoom, but feel free to yeah, feel free to shift the time. I'm gonna wait for you for half a minute. All right, now it's a post disabled participant sharing screen. So maybe I'm just not in the. You can do now. Can you do it now? This is post disabled participant screen sharing. Oh my God. So, okay, let's first move on. Let's try the next speaker for now, given the interest of time. The fourth speaker is supposed to be Dan, Professor Dan or Ori. And Dan is a distinguished scholar in the law school from Cornell. And so obviously for the issues we talk about, just a lot of the regulation and uh, governance issues. So, and that exactly the title, regulating the new financial structure, the challenges and the potential solutions, and where we are. So Dan, the floor is yours. Given interest time, maybe you can try to control it within 20 minutes. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Normally they make the lawyer go last in these type of situations. So what is momentarily Gordon's technological nightmare is my pleasure to be moved up in the speaking order. Just very quickly, a couple of things that I want to talk about. One, the title was a very provocative title that we were given about the new financial architecture. And I'd like to give my own assessment of where we are in building that new architecture. To my mind, what we have at the moment are a series of materials that can be used to build a lot of different things. But none of those things are built yet fully, at least not to the extent that the regulatory question is a static one that we can actually deal with. Second, given that the fluid and incomplete nature of the current financial architecture, I want to talk a little bit about what I see as the key regulatory challenges. Not surprisingly, given that my view is that we're still dealing with an inchoate collection of materials rather than an actual edifice, a lot of these challenges are going to be about how to best marshal our resources, including regulation, in order to help build something that works. And then I'm going to finish with a few thoughts as I look ahead in terms of promise and the potential pitfalls, many of which I see in the current regulatory initiatives in the United States and elsewhere around the world. All right, so what do I see as the new regulatory architecture? At the moment, I see it as a loose, very loose connection of Coasian experiments. What do I mean by that? I mean that what we're observing are entrepreneurs, governments, other actors experimenting with the optimal boundaries of the firm, what markets do better than firms, what firms do better than markets, and ultimately how to connect these firms and markets in an ever-changing marketplace. These experiments are not just technological. I think, as a couple of other speakers have said, they are also importantly experiments in what can scale and what can ultimately build and maintain the public trust as a necessary component to a functioning financial system. Importantly, these experiments are ultimately the product of a series of technological shocks, and I think it's important to list them for two reasons. One, obviously, is the internet. I still think the development of commercial APIs from about 2001 is the defining technological moment in all of this. There is a world that we never entered into where open finance and open banking built on an API architecture completely eliminates the need for the invention of or development of the crypto ecosystem. But it's precisely because of the bottlenecks associated with the conventional financial system that it took us so long to get off the ground with open finance that we then see agitation for change that ultimately takes the form of the crypto ecosystem. And what I see then fundamentally in these technological experiments, at least for the moment, and this is important for the moment, is a form of unbundling both of financial functions and of technological ones. And since we've been talking about stablecoins today, just to give an example on this, our parents' generation would hold money and make payments through a financial institution called a bank. That bank was a bundle of economic functions in the form of deposit taking, payments, and lending. And that bank would then rely on relatively limited other infrastructure in order to perform a given function like make a payment, so a clearinghouse and a central bank. On the technology side, there was also a relatively small number of players, with typical bank maybe having help from their core service provider, and of course, platform firms like Visa or MasterCard. Now let's compare that to the stablecoin ecosystem. Even starting with, but effectively putting aside the entire ecosystem of, say, the Ethereum network, I then get a stablecoin issuer that is an unbundled institution, not engaging in lending, that issues a given instrument. That stablecoin issuer is relying on a whole ecosystem of third-party firms in order to develop things like security protocols, their interface. They're then relying on two different networks in order to perform their basic economic function. One, a relatively closed network of firms and individuals that have direct redemption rights against the issuer. The other, a far more open set of networks where third parties can trade the stablecoin completely independently of that issuer. Last time I checked, USDC and USDT both traded on approximately 60 or 70 different networks. And then, of course, in order to rebuild the other elements of the financial functions, you've got the entrepreneurs and the fintechs who are building lending protocols and other financial services on top of the core stablecoin framework. So what we're seeing is sort of the Cambrian explosion of business models, firms, and markets, and all of which at a relatively early stage at this point. And just to drive home the Cambrian explosion metaphor, it's worth bearing in mind that there are literally no species that emerged during the Cambrian explosion that are alive today. They're the descendants of those species. But what we're looking at today is very unlikely to be what we're looking at in 5 years, in 10 years, let alone the life cycle of financial regulation, which is often measured in decades or centuries. We haven't lived through a period in a very long time where we've seen this much change in the world. And the rest of my comments are really going to be about what that means for regulation and how, to be honest, I think a lot of our regulatory efforts are focused in the wrong places. So what are the key challenges for regulation? The first one is that regulation tends to focus on certain things. It focuses on financial instruments like deposits or securities. It focuses on financial institutions like banks or broker-dealers or asset managers. But one of the things that's going to have to change in this new world is a shift of focus to financial networks. We've, of course, always had financial networks, but they've tended to be self-contained. When I look at a clearinghouse for derivatives, when I look at DTCC, when I look at a payment network, I'm looking at, in effect, a network in two dimensions. And most of the time, historically, I've also been looking at hub and spoke networks. Hub and spoke networks are fantastic for lawyers because we know where to focus our energies, the hub. But once we move to decentralized web-based networks, or start connecting networks with different network structures, which I think is ultimately the direction of travel that we're heading in, we have to start thinking not in terms of financial institutions and markets and instruments, but in terms of how do we regulate the networks, both within and across them. Put differently, we've been regulating lions, tigers, and bears for most of the last 200 years. It's time to start regulating the zoo. And I actually think that there are many benefits that come from shifting the focus of regulation away from the path-dependent sort of categories that we've created ourselves towards a more fluid understanding of how finance grows and evolves over time. One of the things that is requiring of us and will continue to require of us as regulators is that we're going to have to remap the financial system, and not just once, but probably on a continual basis until we reach some sort of equilibrium once all of these experiments have played out. I just want to put this up here again to make this point very quickly. This is Shar's map of the decentralized finance stack. There's many maps of decentralized finance. I think this one has the benefit that is at least tractable. But in reality, the sheer heterogeneity of these systems and the fact that what we're seeing is a vertical and horizontal fragmentation of everything within finance from both an economic and technological perspective forces us to come to terms with the fact that the language and structure of our rules do not map on to this new system. The best we have probably is what in Shar's term is the protocol layer, where we actually have stuff that does financial stuff, but has really become clear over the last decade or so. One, the disaggregation of functions often means that you can avoid regulatory categories by unbundling different types of activities. Two, there are all sorts of other actors within this ecosystem that might require some sort of at least mapping, if not regulation. That includes both the governance of the underlying blockchain networks, the software engineers who are creating the applications at the application layer, and really a whole ever-changing network of different market participants. That's not to say that that's what we should be doing, is regulating each and every node within this network. But as a precursor to effective regulation, you have to know who is in that network, where the potential nodes of failure are, but also where the nodes are that you need to build up in order to actually achieve the benefits that come along with new technology and the new architectures that we might build from these ingredients. Challenge number 3 is then mapping that on to the role of regulation within these new financial networks. Now, some of this is good old-fashioned financial regulation. When I look at the Genius Act or I look at MiCA, I can take comfort in the fact that there are issues of consumer protection, of issues of systemic risk, microprudential safety and soundness, that at least from a regulatory perspective, we understand what it looks like, even if we have to adopt or use new tools in order to achieve those objectives. But the thing I want to highlight is that, again, with the way that this ecosystem is evolving, ultimately its heterogeneity, the fact that it is going to be a network of networks, and that we're at a stage where we still have building blocks but have not built anything, I think the key role for regulation is actually going to fall to what I call network governance. Network governance has 3 components. The first is we have to come to terms with questions about network access. Daryl earlier was talking about a version of network access that was permissioned. Christian was articulating a vision that was maybe somewhat less permissioned. Ultimately, we're going to have to answer questions about who gets access. That's important for all sorts of reasons, not the least of which is eliminating competitive bottlenecks that have historically been barriers to the adoption of new technology, and the creation of value not only for the institutions but their customers. We have experience with this, mostly from other industries. When you think of common carrier rules, for example, for railroads, there are regulatory frameworks out there that envision non-discriminatory access to incumbent networks as a way of leveling the competitive playing field. And the question becomes how tools like that should be used in the brave new world of this new financial architecture. Two, because we're dealing with networks and we're dealing with networks of networks, network interoperability at the technological level becomes extremely important, both because you want to create network effects that can then be passed on to the users of financial products and services, but also because network non-interoperability is an important weapon of exclusion and strategic bottlenecks. The classic example here from outside of finance, or at least in the United States, is Elon Musk and Tesla charger stations, where until they were told that they could not do that, they put a completely useless technological component in all Tesla charger stations that made sure that no other vehicles could use Tesla charger stations. That was forced non-interoperability in order to capitalize on the head start that Tesla had in building a charging station network across the United States. And again, regulation can play a role in eliminating that, both by promoting interoperability, but also by penalizing folks who attempt to use the advantages of incumbency to place walls up that prevent the benefits of these new systems from really taking hold in the marketplace. Lastly, network investment. And this is kind of a tricky one. On the one hand, the basic economics of networks suggest that people are going to compete for the market, which is going to initially lead to overinvestment. But then because of the economics of network effects, we're going to end up with a relatively small number of players. And that small number of players may dilute the incentives of these players in order to engage in ongoing technological investment once they've won the market. At the same time, in a network of networks, there are going to be some parts of the network that create public goods, especially since we're talking about finance. And we might expect underinvestment from the start in those type of or those parts of the overall network stack, in which case there may be a role for public coordination, maybe even public investment in actually bringing these networks into being and making sure that everybody is pulling with the same oar where they need to within the context of a broader competitive system. The last big challenge is the ongoing tension between technology and sovereignty. If you talk or listen to the talking heads, a lot of the time the idea is that networks really don't have borders in effect. But if you've been paying attention over the last 15 years or so, and I know everybody on this call has, states don't tend to sit still and just accept the fact that networks are borderless. They attempt to impose rules on those borders. We saw it with Libra and Diem. We've seen it in the context of conventional financial networks, both in the wake of 9/11, the Iranian effective financial embargo by the United States and its co-opting of the SWIFT network by the United States in 2014, and then the reemergence of this with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The fact of the matter is that financial networks are political, and there are a variety of state-level regulatory tools that can be used to attempt to exert control of those networks. The problem, of course, that in doing so, you are fragmenting the networks. Once people start weaponizing financial networks, people will lean towards creating their own financial networks that are immune to that weaponization. And all of a sudden, the thing that we built to generate network effects is actually a fragmented series of networks that fails to fulfill that promise. This is probably the biggest area where governance matters for these purposes and where governance has not been forthcoming. MiCA does not look like Genius, does not look like the Hong Kong stablecoin regulation, does not look like the Bank of England's proposals for systemically important stablecoins. Whether we ultimately achieve the commoditization that Christian was referencing earlier, which I think should be the goal, will ultimately come down to whether we can achieve some sort of multilateral governance of this new ecosystem. And that's just stablecoins. That's not the broader set of financial networks that we've been talking about today, which adds another dimension to that governance challenge across borders. All right, looking ahead, where do I think we are? Where do I think we should be going? I'm going to adopt a skeptical note and say that I don't know what the future is, but I do know that it's not here yet. This has a very important implication for existing regulatory approaches. I think, just speaking of the United States alone, the critical flaw of both the Genius Act and the currently mooted Clarity Act is that they take the current state of technology as the thing to be regulated. But as I started out, all of this, the reason we're having this conversation is a series of technological developments that are continuing to this day. If we treat the current technological state of play as the thing we're going to be regulating for the next several decades or century, that regulation is going to be out of date quicker than I think most policymakers can imagine. And in the process, that's going to distort outcomes for the users of financial products and services. It's going to distort competition because now all of a sudden we've enshrined in regulation a particular technological state of play without really knowing whether it's an efficient technological state of play, and almost certainly one now that is going to distort investment into these particular technologies before we've had a chance to complete these experiments. Two, and perhaps on a more optimistic note, is that ultimately the technology is changing rapidly, but the functions of finance are not. Throughout today's presentations, we've talked about things like price discovery. We've talked about liquidity. I'll throw another one on the table about the ability to make long-term credible commitments to provide things like insurance, pensions, other types of financial products and services. These things don't change. And it's with that in mind, if you keep the functions in sight and how new technology can help perform these functions, that I think the regulation has to go. The regulation can do things like help firms build public trust and confidence. I think there's also a creative role to be played there in actually creating the conditions under which financial networks can emerge and grow over time. And that ranges from everything from informal standard setting to using legal tools to create a level regulatory playing field that then eliminates some of the bottlenecks that have slowed down technological process in finance over the last, several hundred years, I suppose, but in particular in the internet age. That's it from me. The last thing I'll say, I wrote a book about some of this for the folks that are interested, focusing primarily on money and payments. But I will stop there, and hopefully Gordon has worked out his tech issue.
Thank you very much, Dan. So one thing I learned from you is that regulation for today's tech frontier is bound to decay, as you talked about. But I guess that backs a couple of questions. One is, what can we do? You see, the reality is every country, jurisdictions actually, they have to cater to this somehow. And so I'm not sure what's the right solution. And also, what do you think will happen? But given the interest of time, let's move on for now. Maybe later, if we have can squeeze a little bit of time, we'll come back to you. Now, Gordon, the floor is yours. You have 15 minutes.
Thanks so much. Sorry about that earlier. So hopefully now you can see my screen. So today I'm going to talk about a very small sub-segment of the usage of stablecoin for agentic finance, agentic commerce. This is based on the recent paper that Will Tong, and Isra Prasad and Tony Zhang and I released. We haven't fully pushed out the paper too much yet, but it's online. This is one of the 5 facts. We wrote about 5 facts about stablecoin. This is one of them. And it is about the move from machine executed payments to machine initiated payments. So perhaps to what Christian mentioned, this is maybe a bit of industry industry talk about what is to come. We're seeing a small and growing volume in the machine initiated payments, but perhaps that is also a killer use case later on. Machine executed payments are simple. Most of the card networks, ACH, these are all machine executed. Machine initiated, however, it means that you have autonomous AI agents that could discover, procure services and with no human in the loop potentially. Currently, I think a lot of these do have human in the loop, but we're seeing the emergence of just software deciding what economic parameter to pursue and how to pay for those. And so counterparty is fundamental to change from human to agents in this new model. And Christian mentioned this a little bit before of why conventional rails can or cannot carry agentic agents. I think it's possible that conventional rails could support agentic payment, but there are many pieces that are quite lacking currently, and almost building it up from the ground up on the rail level makes a lot of sense at the current moment than trying to refit the existing system. So one aspect of it is about cheaper cost of transactions, because the cost for machines for these type of programmable payments oftentimes is very small. If you think about having AI agents to access API services, and instead of paying for subscription of APIs, but rather pay per use, you're talking about sub-cent in terms of cost of transaction, in terms of the actual transactions. Therefore, the cost of transaction cannot be greater than the actual transaction cost. And if you use today's card networks, there is a minimum floor of 30 cents. Below that is not really viable. And there is also a set of questions related to batch settlement, how to operate beyond regular business hours and beyond borders. So all of this kind of leads to perhaps using newer financial rails such as blockchain and stablecoin for agentic payment that is emerging. Another area, of course, is having accountability and identifiable accounts, which I'll talk about in a bit. So stablecoin has also already grown quite a bit from 5 billion in the last around 2020 to over 250 billion in the 6-year time span. And most of that is actually programmable throughput, programmable payments of sort. So you might be surprised that the on-chain volume is it reached around $6-7 trillion in a month by December 2025. It seems like a large number, but a lot of those are related to automated market making, related to on-chain lending platforms. So it might seem a bit different than regular payments, but the composition actually matters. I think that's actually a representation of the beginning of this programmable agentic finance, agentic payments. So currently, the vast majority of stablecoin value already move through these programmable means. So smart contracts are involving 35% of stablecoin transfers, and that represent about 70% of the value that are being transferred. And later in the sample, it's about 80% of the value. So programmability, I would argue, is not really about the future anymore. It is what today stablecoins are doing. So if we look at the composition of what these contract-driven, smart contract-driven stablecoin transactions are, vast majority of it are about automating finance, not yet about commerce. So the largest categories are market making, automated market making, specifically on decentralized exchanges, lending in these lending protocols that kind of resembles the repo and reverse repo market, which kind of makes sense. There's a lot of volume because the repo market itself in traditional finance also has a lot of volume and represent a pretty meaningful share of perhaps large wholesale transactions for banks on a day-to-day basis because it has to be rolled over. So very similar to that. In the programmable finance space, we also see a large fraction of value transacted on lending, market making, just similar to any RTGS systems, but the difference is a lot of these are initiated by machines or initiated by smart contracts. And the transaction volume has only increased as the cost of transaction has fallen. So this is a chart where the line is the average cost of transfer for layer one Ethereum. Layer twos are also an order of magnitude cheaper. And then the fraction of or the number of sub $1 transfers has really ballooned to over a billion such transactions in a year. So these are tiny little transfers, and they're used for, oftentimes paying for a small amount of fees for subscription, for accessing API services, etc. So one of the newer protocols that came about is X402, which is a revival of a unused HTTP status code that says payment required. So sometimes you hit a website where you didn't make a payment, you will hit this page that says payment required. Uh, but more recently, the industry got together and turned that status code actually into a form of requesting for payment over blockchain. And the process is the web browser or an agent could request a web page, and it hits this essentially protocol. And the client could also sign a authorization directly on the browser that enables this payment, and it settles the payment directly on chain. So this kind of solves a original issue that the web it just was never able to solve, and it created this whole the whole industry of kind of monetizing for advertisement, monetizing data, which is not being able to directly monetize payments. So this is a very new emerging area of development for on-chain finance, and it has seen quite a bit of volatility in transactions since the initial launch late last year. I think at one point it hit something like a 68 million transactions per month, and then it has come down a bit. So it is yet to be proven how resilient this usage and adoption is, but we're seeing quite a bit of developer interest, at least, in incorporating this protocol into various type of AI agentic setups and programs. The interesting thing about these micro X402 payments is they're very tiny. The median payment size is about 1/100th of a cent. So that's far lower than what a typical even small value credit card payment is. And again, this is because it's initiated by machine on small services. The mix is also shifting. Early on, when it was first launched, a lot of it was related to exchange testing, exchange infra. Over time, the more recent data has shifted to quite a bit of it being related to API access. That is what I mentioned. You could call for make an API call and pay for that single call instead of paying for subscription, as well as agentic usage. These are potentially capturing the set of AI agentic setups. So think cloud code going out there and initiating payments for data, for service, for inference, which is also growing, in which the AI agents are paying for inference costs on the spot instead of, again, subscribing to Anthropics or OpenAI on a monthly basis. So what these type of machine native money unlocks, I think, is a true pay-per-use model for the internet, and it's also enabling a very nascent agent-to-agent market. There are some marketplaces already that facilitate agents to discover other services. Circle actually runs one of these. And then it's also facilitating a new form of microstructure in payments, having really clear pricing on the cost of data and services and how that adds up to potentially a large amount of value that accrues to the internet service providers, not the ISP provider, but the data service providers and etc. So let me just, given the interest of time, I'll conclude here and then we'll have a discussion. So what we highlighted in this paper is 5 facts about stablecoin, but this is only one of the facts, which is commerce are increasingly being conducted by machines on money that's built for them, on stablecoin rails, on blockchains that's kind of built for machines to conduct payments. And I think there's a large gap in what currently is being offered and what is actually needed. This gap is largely resides in this verification and trust realm that was also mentioned a couple times before. Uh, because it is so easy on blockchain rails to make transactions, to make payments, it is even more important to have account identities, for instance, and verifiabilities and trust built into the chain. That way, you can actually verify that even machines are not being swindled and not being spammed for how much they're holding on their accounts. So thanks so much. Let me stop here and take questions.
Okay, thanks, Gordon. I guess my quick question here is that from the facts now for the stable coin payments, including the one under X42, it's kind of flattened. And so is that healthy, or we still need the killer app stuff? But that's been a question out there. But anyway, so given the interest of time, I'm going to stop here and you can think about it. Maybe later you can answer this. But right now, I'd like to move back to Ben Holmstrom. So Ben doesn't need much introduction, and I persuade him to talk about what he learned. And at the Lohan Academy's annual meeting years before, he talked about the future of finance. I'm sure he has a lot to say, but I guess the world is evolving very fast, so it won't be as systematic as we hope. But I hope Ben, the floor is yours. Whatever you want to say.
Okay, do you hear me? There's
Yes,
an
here.
echo here, but I don't know why it's that way. Is there still? Yeah, there's still an echo. Okay, well, let's. It makes it a little harder, but thanks for inviting me to this incredibly interesting session. I must say I learned a lot, though I didn't absorb enough to have a very coherent set of comments on this. But let me start by saying that just reminding us that technology has changed, but the fundamental economic logic underlying everything in terms of this, say, collateral and such hasn't really changed. And so we can learn a lot from looking at historical problems and troubles, crises. We have seen them recently. I think they are very much alive still or possible still. And in fact, I'm interested to hear what nothing was really said about the risks that are increasing with this system, which in my mind looks like they could be formidable. But I'll get back that to that issue shortly. If I just start from what I find most interesting in this sort of the big picture, so to speak, is that much of it has been about the architecture and moving up to higher levels, especially, say, Danori's comments resonated in me very much. I think that doesn't just apply for these financial systems. It's true. Just look at Europe right now. I think they would need a really big reset with architecture. They are centralized and so on. And this idea that popped up all the time here, that let's have interoperability in order to foster innovation and allow very different parties or different structures still cooperate in some manner. I think that's got to be the future. I'm just thinking of, say, Amazon. When Amazon changed to APIs, I mean, Amazon exploded. And their OpenAI I'm sorry, open banking, which was mentioned here along the way, is one of the success stories of Europe. Unfortunately, the success all happens in England or UK. You know, they have given UK the right tools, but they can't use them themselves. You know, so there's a lot of questions here in the architecture level. Where are the leverage points going to be? You know, there's going to be smart people trying to figure out all the time where leverage is, and for sort of a big leverage battle that's outside this is Nvidia versus all the other smaller players. And I have a sense that Nvidia has the architecture right and the internal operations right, and that's why it is what it is right now compared to the various sort of short-term players, if you wish, those who have to redesign things at every sort of iteration of technological innovation. So this question about what architecture and how to sort of command interoperability and control interoperability for society, I have in mind. So that's a hugely critical question. How to approach it, from that point of view. I'm thinking about repo. I mean, the most fascinating for me is the repo market here, in terms of it has suddenly basically become money, almost exactly money. It's a very little. It used to be just collateral, but it's moving in the direction of becoming sort of, in some sense, collateral, money or money-like. So the architecture of the collateral market, for instance, and is a big issue, and I think I've seen all of this has come up here. I'm just kind of rehearsing this from my sort of just almost purely economic perspective, because I'm not a technologist at all. But that's where I see this moving, or where the battles also are going to be fought. And so a few words about the battle. I have a hard time figuring out how can we even agree on the interoperability dimensions. We have seen the geoeconomics or geopolitics really heating up. Where are we going to find agreements if we are really totally transactional, almost, as the world is moving ahead? So that would be a big concern in terms of, related to that, how are we going to agree on something breaks down? So nothing was really said about these automatic, clearings and so on. But I can't believe that not something could go wrong really bad. And in fact, take the case of collateral. It becomes sort of more and more liquid, the collateral, and the velocity goes up with automatic settlements and so on. There was we heard talk about how much more or how much more efficiently collateral could be used. I'm not entirely sure I agree on the 10% to some imagine 100%. I think there's always going to be slack. We can't get sort of instant clearance everywhere. There will be people involved in between and so on. But the collateral is the velocity of money. If at least the velocity of collateral goes up, I suspect the velocity of money will go up. And velocity, that means that we can transact more. And though, by the way, history doesn't at all say that even if velocity goes up, that somehow the economy will grow enormously faster. That wasn't true when we went to origin and distribute. The collateral market grew enormously, and we had a financial crisis. But there were, what we call safe assets. They didn't, as a percentage of all assets, they didn't noticeably increase. I mean, these are hard things to sort of measure, but there is not an automatic result like that. The other thing is, if velocity goes up, the risk almost surely is going to go up. you know, and so I would be, as an outsider, you know, really worried about the potential risks, and ask you to tell me how you are going to resolve crisis. Because now that we have a less efficient system, we have days. I mean, in the case of the great financial crisis, you know, that Roosevelt had to deal with, he shut it down for a week, and sort of to buy time. I mean, there's no shutting down and buying time here. And so, how are we going to dig out of this if we suddenly have a big crash? So, I'm very much in favor of not, you know, integrating all the different parts. I'm happy that there's a Chinese system. I'm happy that there's a US system. I'm happy there's a lot of things going on in the global south. And then I hope also that Europe will get something. For God's sake, let's not have them become one gigantic, you know, collateral sort of market, because if that crashes, that's a spells real disaster. So I like firewalls in this sense, and you need some inefficiency because you cannot make it perfect. You got to have something that gives you time to sort of breathe and take a breather and see how it clears up. At least this is how I see it. Maybe I'm too old-fashioned, but and I hope I never will see the answer to this question. But I worry a lot about that, and I would think I heard very little about that, and in the sense that. So again, let me just take a look at the one thing I would like to add to this architecture thing is that the global south, if you look at India, if you look at, you know, with India, with the US, what is the universal coin, and say the peaks in South America and so on. I mean, they are incredibly creative, and they have found, maybe because their systems used to be simpler, they have found a lot of architectural designs that are really impressive. And the speed at which they are doing it is also remarkable. In fact, since we are here in China, so to speak, you know, China, of course, has had an incredible run, starting with our host here, you know, and you know, also WeChat and Alipay and so on. I mean, in a short time, they have grown out to be very dominant. So there's a point that saying that if you go, it's a lot easier to start from a blank slate, so to speak. You know, so in that sense, I think, you know, US is still using cash. I have cash in my pocket right now. You know, you can't be without cash here. And Europe is going away from that, but they have what I think is already a legacy system for payments. I don't think that's going to survive for very long. But then if you look at the Eastern Europe, and especially say the Estonia, to take an example, they started with a blank slate because there was nothing worthwhile behind after to save from the Soviet crash, and they have managed to create an incredibly efficient system for all sorts of manners, and that's a place where one could learn certain things. So again, I worry about the geoeconomics, geopolitics, in the enthusiasm for sort of creating a gigantic, wonderfully humming machine. I believe in actually having interoperability and also firewalls within this system or between this system, and I, going back to Dan's presentation, which is most closely to mine because it's about Williamson and Coase and so on. You know, who will have the levers in this new system. It will migrate to various places, and it can't be so that some individual, small group, they can't be, Elon Musk sort of controlling the whole system or something like that. I would say that's another concern I have, and another reason to have not try to aim for too efficient global system. So one has to be careful, basically, about this. So these are some thoughts from somebody who understands next to nothing about the technology.
Thank you very much, Ben. And so we still have several minutes, and that's the time I think I don't want to dominate the questions. So I think you guys, our distinguished speakers, you can try to answer, challenge Ben's view, and always ask each other who wants to talk.
Can I offer a rebuttal?
Yes, please.
I
I'm so
see
happy you are here.
I see a thread of somebody called it battle lines, but I think of it more as upcoming competition between different views. So one is decentralization versus control of the few. I think a bank talked about the few. And I think that's going to be a really important theme going forward. The original premises and philosophy of DeFi are kind of antithetical to some of the architectures that have come up today, including my emphasis on the importance of central bank money. And central banks are going to limit who gets access to their money. As I said, a CBDC is not going to work in the near term in the United States. So are we really going to rely on only banks having access to the settlement medium on all of this architecture? So that's one big thing. Christian also, I think, appropriately asked, is it really going to happen that multiple countries, jurisdictions are going to get together and build common architecture? I think I'm also skeptical that it's going to happen in the near term. It's too hard to coordinate with competing interests, both commercial and geopolitical. And Banked also talked about how interoperability and how do we arrange that. Those are really fault lines or tectonic potential breaks in how this architecture all comes to fruition in an efficient way. I myself am not thinking that the architecture or technology is too powerful, Banked. I think instantaneous capabilities are good, not bad, but regulators need to, from a policy viewpoint, control how these technologies are used. We shouldn't build in frictions and latencies into the technology, but rather policymakers should guide financial stability because that's where the externalities are. And I think the private sector is going to solve a lot of these problems that we've discussed all morning, just because the market value of solving these problems is high enough that the private sector can do it, and then the regulators and policymakers need to make sure that we have investor protection and financial stability. So that's a few comments.
Yeah, I will just add a really quick comment on top of that. I strongly agree with Daryl's view on this. The interesting question to me is almost like, are we going to be able to speed run to the end outcome where we have more open networks, we have more competition, and at the same time, we recreated the right safeguards and guardrails around them so that they can actually thrive? Or are we going to inevitably go through an intermediate phase where, because there are all these challenges in making truly open networks work when it comes to financial services, there's going to be increasing market power and concentration. And so when you look at some of these networks that, under the premise of the technology that's been incubated over a decade in crypto and decentralized networks, try to reconcentrate power in the hands of a single platform architect, again, whether it's a network focused on payments or financial services, I think it's the same playbook. That's the temptation in the private sector. I think we're going to see many companies try to accelerate towards that outcome and leverage the assets that they have today, including through AI. AI, if anything, enhances the strength of distribution. So if you have distribution either on the retail side or the merchant side, you can scale much faster. That would land us in a world that's actually not better than the one we started with. So it'd be deeply ironic that everything changes, but nothing changes. To quote Tommaso de Lampedusa. I do think eventually there will be a pushback, and maybe we'll land in the second phase on the right outcome. But again, the public sector, I think, can play a big role by pushing interoperability across all of these different experiments.
I'd like to add that I agree with both Christian and Daryl's comments. And what I also see is this centralization versus decentralized debate is not really about technology. To me, is a lot of it is just about, it comes down to balance sheet, right? Do you see central banks and banking intermediaries holding the largest balance sheets and intermediate between markets and for payments as well? Or do you see that balance sheet intensity to migrate to the end users, to asset owners, to smart contracts? And I think all of this solution is, a lot of it is due to there are frictions that come about because there are balance sheet heavy intermediaries, whether it's a central bank or banking intermediaries. And so the efficiency gain, I think, as Kelly mentioned, a lot of it does come from just balance sheet efficiency and moving that activity to be more on the edges, kind of like edge computing in a way.
Anybody else wants to chip in? We have 1 minute.
Can I comment just something that?
Yes, please.
It's worth remembering, why is current money so liquid? Because basically we are asymmetrically ignorant about why. The ignorance part is absolutely central to liquidity. It should be a no questions asked world. It's absolutely not a world where everybody tries to figure out all the details. It's as far away from this conversation we have had here is that we need to sort of improve the information maximally. But even that is at some level a misconception. I mean, yes, in the space of when it's all in the cloud, so to speak, that's fine. But when it comes to humans trying to interpret facts, there just isn't such a thing as, we look at the same thing and we will all think in our brains differently. So transparency is actually historically have been a big enemy in the financial systems, in the sense that it has been the source of, when people start seeking information a lot, that has usually been a sign of a financial crisis. So it's just a reflection about how important, liquidity and sort of, in a certain sense, ignorance are. I mean, somebody needs to know it, but not sort of the broader public. And the second thing is to understand is that, collateral is local. Finns know, so I'm from Finland, so Finns know collateral in a very different way, Finnish collateral, than the United States knows. And so this already put one, big, sort of, I don't know how you sort of think that it all should come together into some gigantic system where we all see the collateral similarly. But maybe I'm misunderstanding everything. But this is one answer, I think, to the question that was up, that we only use 10% of the collateral. I think if you add up all the assets in the world, you get very, very wrong number on what the actual amount of collateral sort of internationally is. I don't know if you have thought about that. Duffy must have thought about this.
Barry, want to say something, or let's close?
I think Bengt should have the last word.
Okay. Yeah. So, there's a lot of the unresolved issues, but I think we have a very fantastic dialogue this morning or this evening. So thank you very much for everyone.